Right, Global Entrepreneurship Network, are you ready for a big day? Are you, well, I mean, I'm going to ask one more time, are you ready for a big day? Right, let's do this. I'm going to introduce you to someone. I think it's great when it's almost impossible to put a guest into a particular bucket or pigeonhole, because that for me is the mark of what every one of you is, which is an interesting and often multi-hatted person. So let's introduce someone to the stage who is many things. They're an adjunct professor at UC Berkeley. They are also a musician and a photographer. They've been known to sing, whether that's in the shower or not, I don't know, but I have it on good authority. A little bit of opera has passed their lips. They have over 200 patents to their name. They also lead a very interesting company and organization, 4x9. And what we've asked Alex to do this morning is really take us behind the scenes. So we hear about artificial intelligence, we hear about large language models. What we don't often hear enough about, in our opinion, is how they actually work. So welcome to day 3, and please give it up for the brilliant Alex Cohen.
Hi, everybody. I'm just going to check that, make sure everything's working here. Okay. All right. So today I'm going to be talking, sorry if my voice is a bit loud. Today we're going to be talking about not just sounding right with large language models, but achieving expert level thinking. And I think that we've all experienced working with large language models and seeing how they create hallucinations. And we're going to tell you a little bit about how that happens, and then a little bit of the ways about how we're solving it as well. Let's make sure I can get through this. Okay, so just a little bit about me. So as the introduction mentioned, I'm originally a biologist, actually from Brown University, studied neuroscience. And along the way, I decided to switch to humanities. And when I did that, I had this odd experience when I got to the university for my PhD. I thought I was going to be a teaching assistant, and that meant I thought that I'd be working with a professor. Unfortunately, it turned out that I was actually going to be teaching courses myself. At the last minute, I heard about this. And then not only that, I had to teach how to write. And that was actually kind of a stretch for me, because I had never, although I wrote a lot and knew how to write, I didn't really know how to teach writing. I didn't know what really constitutes necessarily a well-written text. When you think about it, like, what do you really need to do? And I realized, I thought about it, I said, you really need to have organization, you need to have evidence-based assertions, insights, you need to be able to create insights and explain insights. You need to be able to think critically, which is really important. So prose, right, must do more than just simply report. It must question, evaluate, and justify itself. So reasoning itself must be transparent, evidence-based, fair-minded, and more importantly, it has to be aware of its own limitations. And large language models have none of these features. So when you think about it, what large language models are really doing, as I'll show you next, is that they are really taking a large amount of data, all these petabytes of information, and what they're doing is they're compressing it, in a sense, into these series of vectors, which are really relationships between words. So they're not the words themselves in the exact order, they're just the relationships between words themselves. And from these petabytes of data, you compress them into these vectors, and these vectors are the relationships. It's a way of measuring the relationships between words. Out of that, and this is kind of a mysterious process, to be honest, the researchers actually don't know precisely how this functions, but these higher order concepts that are derived from these relationships have a lot to do with the meaning of these texts. And then ultimately, when these models are designed and are constructed, the last stages are really what's called an inference or reconstruction. So you reconstruct the data from a prompt into an answer. So here's a quick example of what the sort of general AI stack looks like today. And this is only, of course, for large language models. So we start with a very basic model data layer, all the data that we've entered into the system. We then train it and run a neural network which creates the vectors and the relationships between words. And then the application layer is where we interact with it, and that uses the inference layer, which is it's called an attention mechanism, where we reconstruct data out of that mass of data, right? And so the next thing that's important to consider also is what we all know is the context window. It's the window that you're actually using when you're speaking or communicating with the large language model. It consists of guardrails, which is and a system prompt, which tells it how to function, how not to let you ask questions about suicide or nuclear bombs. And then you enter a query to it, and then you get a response. And these responses are made token by token. They're made completely probabilistically. It's always trying to find the best next word to the total context of the window, which means all the text that you've entered into it, the system prompt, the guardrails, everything else. And this process continues one query after the next. And this whole thing here is called the context window. And it's very limited, actually. And it's where a lot of the magic of these large language models come from. So a little bit now about a thought experiment. I don't know if you've all heard about this, but there's an ancient thought experiment called about the infinite monkeys. And the question was, if you took an infinite number of monkeys, all typing for an infinite amount of time, would they create the works of Shakespeare? Would they create the works of, say, even of a Shakespearean sonnet? And the answer is they never would. So a random set of texts being created by a computer system can never create something like a sonnet. Then how does a large language model do this, right? So the thing about large language models is that they are taking all this data, right, and reconstructing it based on the probabilities instead. So one of the problems with them is that the less probable the answer, the less likely a large language model will come up with it. Now, the thing about insights and the thing about working with your own data is that you really want to be able to do is you want to have an improbable answer. You don't want to have a probable answer. You want to have an answer which is something that wouldn't have been there before, that is not in the data necessarily, right? You want unique answers, and thus deep insights are improbable. But improbable does not equal impossible, and that's important to consider. So some of the new techniques that we'll talk about in a second change the improbable, the impossible or near impossible, and the near improbable to possible. Let me just get to the right page here 1 second, sorry. So non-experts tend to perceive confidence as competence. And these large language models are aligned for users to produce confident-sounding text. But confidence is not the same as competence, right? And they can sound knowledgeable, but they might not actually be knowledgeable. Now, if you were to take a large language model and ask it something like, how do I be successful, right? And then it takes these millions of books, motivational speeches, and advice columns, and you'd get something like this. You get set clear goals, work hard, believe in yourself, and never give up, which is a very generic response. Technically correct, perhaps, but very generic, right? It averages everything together, and they can create convincing output, but they will sound non-authoritative. I mean, they'll sound authoritative to a non-expert. So if we look at what their outputs are, in the case of term papers and summaries, a 99% accuracy can be just fine. Right? If there's small word choices that are bad, that's fine too. If it's not quite as accurate as it should be, that's probably okay. But when you're doing other kinds of things, like patents, legal pharma, credit risk, flying a plane, would you really fly on a plane if 7 out of 1,000 flights were to crash? Of course not. So some of the problems that we have with these large language models is that they have black box reasoning. There's no way to understand in this context window exactly why it creates the output that it does. So we need expert reasoning tools instead. One-shot context windows and other systems are just not enough. So what does an expert really do? How do we get real insights? So an expert in any field, and a lot of you are experts in your fields, you draw deep insights by reasoning across multiple documents and sources. You rely on years of experience grounded in data that is not accessible to large language models at all. And this is important to consider because large language models don't know what you know, right? They only know what they've been taught. They only know what they've been able to read. And that is thousands of texts. It's all the novels that have been written for centuries, right? It's philosophy. It's corporate documents that you can scrape from the web and so on. But the real important data is not accessible to them. An expert uses specialized tacit methods, hard-won tricks of the trade, which you know, but they don't know. You haven't written them down. Your particular ways of thinking are not written down. Large language models can't be trained on them. They also experts can show your work, and you can justify your reasoning step by step. Again, a large language model can't do this. If you were in a standard prompt and prompt response on a large language model, and you asked it, how did you get that answer? It's actually going to confabulate it. It's going to make it up. It's not going to be how it actually thought about it. So what are the current techniques that we're using today to get rid of this problem, to reduce hallucinations, to reduce errors? I'll give you a few of these techniques. So one of them is called chain of thought, and you may have heard about this. It's in the context window when you actually are prompting a large language model and you're asking it questions. You give it step-by-step instructions. That's one way to force it to be very accurate. But again, it's based on all the data that it knows, again, not what you know. RAG is called retrieval augmented generation. In this case, you present the model with specific data that, sort of like search, that it needs to answer a question. And you use typically chain of thought on top of that to actually get to the answer. Prompt chaining is when you take a series of prompts and you chain them together one after the other, which is a better way than doing a simple step-by-step query. The more common stuff that we're doing today now are called agents. And these allow very important things such as observability, a little bit of observability into the reasoning process itself of a model, and then more importantly perhaps is the repeatability. So if you have a lot of the same documents and you want to be able to analyze each and every one of these documents, how do you do that the same way each time so you get reliable answers? You can't rely on a model to come up with another way of doing it on the fly every time, because the data that it creates for you then is going to be inconsistent. And finally, some of the newer techniques that we're using now are called game techniques, where you do iterative ranking. So you do a number of different outputs, and you analyze those outputs, and you rank them according to which ones sound right. Again, some of the same problems occur because, again, the model is just using its data. So you need to really ground how do you ground a large language model in truth? This is not something that they currently can do. So the way that you can get around this problem is one of the ways that we're doing things in my own company is that we're providing large language models with our own ground of truth. Right? We give it data that it needs to answer its questions, and we tell it precisely how to answer those questions, how to analyze them, how to break it down, using some of the same techniques that I used in teaching writing to teach a model to do what it needs to do for all of us. And the results are actually quite a lot better. And we completely reduce hallucinations to almost zero. And let me just show you a bit about that. So here's an example of what our output today. We can create these very detailed reports. In this case, it's about a patent portfolio for a company. And you get these detailed reports describing each and every one of the categories. And you ask it about a category, and this is all data that we've thrown into the system that it's reasoned over and over again. You actually can get and chat with the system to ask about your data, what you're looking for from the data that you provided the system itself. So this data, again, is not out there in the public, right? It's nothing that the model has been trained on. It's what actually you're using for your own data. And you can throw in things like thousands of scientific papers. You can throw in things like patents. You can throw in all the work that you've done for your company or for what your company has worked on, and then analyze all those documents together in a way that then, using your expert reasoning systems, your expert techniques, can be applied to the data itself. So that's what we're doing. And I think that's about it for the talk. Usually I'm open to questions, but I think we don't have time for that today. So thanks very much. I think we're done.
Ace.
Okay, good.
Excellent. Well, you say usually you're open for questions.
Yeah.
When do you have to leave the GEC? I know I'm getting personal. Are you around a bit today?
I'm around until about 4 o'clock today, yeah.
Amazing. So
but I'd love to talk to people if they want to have any questions.
That would be great. Thank you for that. I'll grab
great.
that. But Alex, stay with us.
Thanks a
Stay
lot.
with us because I've got 2 quick questions. Can we have another round of applause for Alex Cohen, everybody?
Thanks, Ian.
Thank you, Alex. That was fascinating. I've got 2 very super quick questions. Number 1, for a delegate who's now suitably intrigued, which I'm sure they are.
Yeah.
What resources are out there? Where do you go? Where should we go to just get a little more genned up on all of this?
In terms of knowledge, or in terms of actually reading?
Yeah, just saying, look, this has piqued my interest. Let's keep reading. Any
well,
books,
I would say actually there's very little out there in an organized way. It's actually out there in large numbers of documents and papers. There's actually I've never found anything really convincing out there that you can access to really
Alex,
understand.
I sense a publishing deal coming on here. I mean,
that's true. It could be true. There are some books and stuff. I mean, people are doing it. O'Reilly, for instance, has a lot of really interesting books on the subject. But all these are very technical. They're not really for people who are just trying to understand how things
that's why
actually
we
work.
value the translators. So thank you.
Yeah.
The other super quick question was, particularly in terms of the students that you're teaching at the moment. If you said to yourself, if only they understood, which of course they do when you've taught them, if only they understood X about large language models, their lives could change. What would X be?
I would say the one thing that you need to do with a large language model is present your own information into it. People tend to ask it for information as though we're a search engine, but instead you need to actually add your data first and then ask it to reason over that. And that's one way of doing.
Love that. So feed it with those own ingredients.
Right.
Before you start.
And so with Claude and with OpenAI, you have a project area where you can actually dump documents in. The problem is that it's a random process still.
Yeah.
And so my company's trying to do that in a way that is a repeatable, reasonable process as opposed to the way these systems work today.
Love that. Super helpful. Now, I slightly wish we had a sort of fireside chat following this, but we don't.
Okay.
For now, though, Alex, I am going to keep you because I'd like to use you in a very friendly way as a guinea pig.
Oh, really?
In our next session. So will you stay with us for a session with Rebecca?
I suppose.
Go on, then.
If I can have some water.
Yeah, we'll bring some water over. Ladies and gentlemen, Alex Cohen, everybody.
Thanks a lot.
Come and have a seat, Alex.
Should I sit here?